The gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming territory as Liam Xander watched the life drain from the eyes of the man who tried to rob his cattle, feeling nothing but cold indifference as another body fell to the dust of 1879. The surrounding ranch hands stepped back, knowing better than to comment on the ruthless efficiency with which their boss had dispatched the would-be rustler. "Bury him," Liam commanded, holstering his Colt revolver without ceremony, "and double the night watch. Where there's one thief, there's bound to be more." The men hurried to follow his orders, careful to avoid meeting his steel-gray eyes. At 32, Liam had earned a reputation as one of the most successful and feared ranchers in the territory. His sprawling property, the X-Bar Ranch, boasted the finest cattle for 100 miles. But success had come at a terrible price. Liam mounted his stallion, a massive black beast as intimidating as its master, and rode toward the ridge overlooking his land. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling plains where his cattle grazed. It was a sight that should have filled him with pride, but Liam felt nothing beyond a cold satisfaction at what he'd built. 10 years had passed since he'd found his wife and young son murdered by bandits in their modest cabin while he'd been away on a cattle drive. 10 years since he'd buried his heart alongside their bodies and vowed never to let anyone close again. The X-Bar Ranch had been built on that vow on relentless work, calculated risks, and a reputation for merciless dealing with anyone who crossed him. As twilight descended, Liam rode back to the main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of sturdy timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Unlike most successful ranchers, he hadn't bothered with many luxuries. The house was functional, like everything else in his life. His foreman, Timothy Miller, approached as Liam dismounted. "Boss, we got word from town. Train's coming through tomorrow with those breeding bulls you ordered from back east." "I'll head in to meet it," Liam replied, his voice betraying no emotion. "Have Jackson and Peters ready to help transport them back." "There's something else," Timothy added, hesitating. "Sheriff Bennett sent word your brother-in-law's arriving on that same train." Liam's jaw tightened. Robert Walsh, his dead wife's brother, had written months ago about visiting, but Liam had never replied, hoping the man would take the hint. "Apparently he hadn't, not my concern," Liam said flatly. "If he comes to the ranch, tell him I'm busy." Timothy nodded, knowing better than to argue. Everyone who worked for Liam understood his rules. Do your job, don't ask personal questions, and never, ever mention his past. That night, Liam sat alone on his porch, a glass of whiskey in hand. The vast Wyoming sky stretched overhead, stars glittering like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Once, he would have shared this view with Sarah, his wife, pointing out constellations while their son slept inside. Now, he barely noticed the beauty, seeing only darkness punctuated by distant, cold light. Morning came with the promise of another scorching summer day. Liam rode into Redemption Springs, the growing town that served as the commercial hub for ranchers and farmers across 3 counties. The train was due at noon, and he arrived with time to spare, tying his horse outside the mercantile to purchase supplies while he waited. Martha Jenkins, the proprietor's wife, greeted him with the same nervous smile she always wore in his presence. "Mr. Xander, good morning. What can I help you with today?" "Just the usual supplies," he replied, placing a list on the counter. As Martha gathered his items, the bell above the door jingled, and a woman Liam had never seen before entered the store. She was clearly not from Redemption Springs, dressed in a practical traveling suit of deep blue that complemented her auburn hair, which was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. "Excuse me," she addressed Martha. "I'm looking for directions to the sheriff's office." "Just down the street, dear, the building with the large sign and porch. Sheriff Bennett should be there this time of day," Martha replied warmly. The woman thanked her and turned to leave, but paused when she noticed Liam watching her. She met his gaze directly, something few people in town dared to do. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, clear and intelligent. "Good morning," she said with a slight nod. Liam merely inclined his head in acknowledgement, returning his attention to his supply list. He had no interest in exchanging pleasantries with strangers, especially ones who would likely be gone on the next train out. After completing his purchases, Liam headed to the station to await the arrival of his bulls. The platform was busier than usual, with several families waiting to greet arriving passengers. He stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a post with his arms crossed. The distant whistle announced the train's approach, and soon the massive iron horse was pulling into the station, belching steam and smoke. Liam waited as passengers disembarked before approaching the conductor about his livestock. "Mr. Xander," the conductor called, recognizing him. "Your bulls are in the last car, fine specimens too. I've got papers for you to sign." As Liam followed the man toward the end of the train, he caught sight of the woman from the mercantile again. She was speaking with a man who had just disembarked, Robert Walsh, his brother-in-law. The realization stopped Liam in his tracks. The woman must be connected to Robert somehow. Determined to avoid a confrontation, Liam quickly completed the transaction for his bulls and arranged for his ranch hands to transport them back to the X-bar. He was nearly clear of the station when Robert spotted him. Liam Xander." Liam considered ignoring him but knew it would only delay the inevitable. He turned, his expression unreadable as Robert approached, the auburn-haired woman at his side. "10 years and you can't even write back to your family," Robert said, his tone more hurt than angry. "We stopped being family when Sarah died," Liam replied coldly. Robert flinched but pressed on. "I'd like you to meet Nora Wallace. She's traveling west to take up a teaching position in Redemption Springs." The woman Nora extended her hand. "Mr. Xander, Robert has told me much about you." "Nothing good, I'm sure," Liam replied, reluctantly taking her hand for the briefest moment. "On the contrary," she said, her gaze unflinching. "He speaks of you with great respect." Liam doubted that very much. "If you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." "Liam, wait," Robert called as he turned to leave. "I'm staying in town for a few weeks to help Nora get settled. I'd like to visit the ranch, see what you've built." "It's not a tourist attraction," Liam said over his shoulder. "Sarah would want us to stay connected," Robert added quietly. "She loved you too much to want you to cut off everyone who cared about you." Liam stopped, his back still turned. "Sarah's dead. What she would want doesn't matter anymore." He left without looking back, aware of the shock on the faces of townspeople who'd overheard the exchange. Let them talk. He didn't care what anyone thought of him. 3 days passed, and Liam had nearly forgotten about Robert and the teacher when Timothy informed him that they were at the main house, requesting to see him. He'd been out since dawn, working with the new bulls, and was in no mood for visitors. "Tell them I'm busy," he instructed, but Timothy shifted uncomfortably. "I did, boss. The lady, Miss Wallace, she said she'd wait all day if necessary, said something about a promise to your wife." Liam's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "That's what she told me. Said she had something that belonged to your wife and she promised to deliver it personally." Anger and curiosity warred within Liam. Finally, curiosity won. "Fine, send them to my office." He entered through the back of the house, washing quickly before making his way to the small room he used for ranch business. Robert and Nora were already seated when he entered, neither rising as he took his place behind the desk. "You have something of Sarah's?" he asked without preamble, addressing Nora directly. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather-bound book. "Her journal. Robert found it among his mother's things after she passed last winter." Liam stared at the book, recognizing it immediately. Sarah had written in it daily, often sitting by the fire in the evenings while he played with their son. "Why bring it to me now?" he asked, making no move to take it. "Because you need it," Robert said simply. "Because for 10 years you've been living like a ghost, and Sarah would be heartbroken to see what you've become." "You know nothing about what I've become," Liam said, his voice dangerously low. "I know enough," Robert replied. "Everyone in 3 counties knows Liam Xander, the man with no heart. The rancher who built an empire but lives like a hermit. The gunslinger who shoots first and never bothers to ask questions." "Robert," Nora cautioned, placing a restraining hand on his arm. Liam's gaze shifted to her. There was something in her eyes that wasn't fear or judgment, something that looked suspiciously like compassion. It infuriated him more than Robert's accusations. "I don't need your pity, Miss Wallace," he said coldly, "nor do I need reminders of a life that's long gone." "It's not pity, Mr. Xander," she replied calmly. "It's respect for the man Sarah loved, the man who, according to her journal, had the kindest heart and the gentlest hands she'd ever known." Her words struck him like physical blows. No one had spoken of him that way in years. No one remembered the man he'd been before tragedy had carved away everything soft within him. "Leave the journal if you must," he said finally. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to run." Robert looked ready to argue, but Nora placed the journal on the desk and stood. "Thank you for seeing us, Mr. Xander. I hope you'll read it when you're ready." They left, and Liam remained at his desk, staring at the journal for a long time before finally locking it in a drawer without opening it. He had no use for memories. They were like wounds that never properly healed, always threatening to reopen at the slightest touch. The following weeks brought an unexpected amount of rain, keeping Liam busy with ranch work and giving him an excuse to avoid town. He'd heard that Nora Wallace had started teaching at the newly expanded schoolhouse in Redemption Springs, and that she'd taken a room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. Robert had apparently extended his stay, helping with repairs to the schoolhouse and making himself useful around town. None of that concerned Liam, or so he told himself. Yet he found himself thinking about Nora Wallace at odd moments, her direct gaze, her calm voice, the way she'd spoken of Sarah as if she understood what had been lost. It irritated him that he couldn't simply dismiss her from his thoughts. One evening, as a summer storm raged outside, Liam found himself drawn to the drawer containing Sarah's journal. Perhaps it was the weather, reminiscent of the night he'd proposed to Sarah all those years ago, or perhaps it was simple weakness. But he unlocked the drawer and took out the book. The first entry was dated just after their wedding. Sarah's delicate handwriting filled the pages with observations about their new life together, her hopes for their future, and her deep love for her husband. Liam read until his eyes burned, following their life through Sarah's perspective, the birth of their son, the struggles of their early years on the land, and the happiness they'd found despite the hardships. The final entry was dated 3 days before her death. In it, she wrote of her pride in what they were building together and her excitement about Liam's return from the cattle drive. The last lines struck him like a physical blow. "I thank God every day for bringing Liam into my life. His strength carries us through the hard times, but it's his gentle heart that makes every day worth living. I pray our son grows to be just like his father, strong when necessary, but always kind." Liam closed the book, his hands trembling. For the first time in a decade, he wept, the sound of his grief drowned out by the thunder that shook the windows of the empty house. The next morning, he rode into town, the journal secure in his saddlebag. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Redemption Springs were muddy, forcing him to dismount and lead his horse carefully. He was headed toward the schoolhouse when he saw Nora emerging from the mercantile, carrying a basket of supplies. She spotted him immediately, her surprise evident as he approached. "Mr. Xander, this is unexpected." "I'd like to return this," he said, retrieving the journal, "and to thank you for bringing it to me." Nora studied his face, noting the evidence of his sleepless night. "Would you care to walk with me? The children don't arrive for another hour." He hesitated, then nodded, falling into step beside her as they made their way toward the schoolhouse. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the squelch of mud beneath their boots and the occasional greeting from townspeople who watched their progress with undisguised curiosity. "I read it," Liam finally said as they reached the schoolhouse steps. "All of it." Nora set her basket down. "And she saw me differently than I saw myself," he admitted. "She saw goodness where I only saw necessity." "Perhaps she saw the truth that you couldn't," Nora suggested gently. Liam looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "Sarah always believed the best of everyone. It was her nature." "And yours was to protect what you loved," Nora said. Robert told me how you built your first cabin with your own hands, how you worked from sunrise to sunset to make a home for Sarah and your son." "That man is gone," Liam said roughly. "Is he?" Nora asked. "Or is he just buried beneath years of pain?" Before Liam could respond, the schoolhouse door opened and Robert appeared, surprise registering on his face at the sight of his brother-in-law. "Liam, is everything all right?" "Fine," Liam replied stiffly. "I was just returning the journal to Miss Wallace." "You should keep it," Nora said. "It belongs with you." Liam looked down at the book in his hands, then reluctantly tucked it back into his coat. "Thank you." "Robert and I were planning to visit the new families who settled north of town this weekend," Nora said. "The children haven't been able to attend school regularly because of the distance. I thought perhaps you might join us, as the X-Bar borders their properties. You could introduce us." The invitation caught Liam off guard. "I don't socialize with my neighbors." "Then perhaps it's time to start," she replied simply. "Saturday morning, if the weather holds. We'll be leaving from Mrs. Peterson's at 8. It was a dismissal as effective as any Liam had ever delivered, leaving him no choice but to tip his hat and take his leave. As he rode back to the X-Bar, he told himself he would not be joining them on Saturday. He had no interest in playing tour guide to a schoolteacher and his dead wife's brother. Yet when Saturday dawned clear and bright, Liam found himself riding toward town, a decision he couldn't entirely explain even to himself. He arrived at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house just as Nora and Robert were loading supplies into a small wagon. "You came," Nora said, smiling as if she'd expected him all along. "I'm headed that direction anyway," Liam replied gruffly. "Might as well make sure you don't get lost." The day stretched before them, filled with visits to 4 homesteading families. Liam had never bothered to learn their names, despite the fact that they'd settled on land adjacent to his northern pastures over the past year. He watched as Nora spoke with parents and assessed children's educational needs, her patience and genuine interest evident in every interaction. At the last homestead, the Petersons had prepared a late lunch for their visitors. Mrs. Peterson, a worn but cheerful woman with 3 young children, insisted they stay to eat. Liam found himself seated at their rough-hewn table, listening as Nora discussed plans for rotating lessons among the distant families during winter months when travel to town would be difficult. "Mr. Xander," Mrs. Peterson addressed him directly, "we've been neighbors for near a year, but this is the first time we've had the pleasure of your company." Liam shifted uncomfortably. "I keep to myself, madam." "Well, we're grateful for your visit today," she continued. "My husband was saying just last week that he'd like to speak with you about water rights for the creek that crosses both our properties." Before Liam could respond with his usual brusqueness about property boundaries, Nora interjected. "Mr. Xander is quite knowledgeable about water management. He's implemented some impressive irrigation systems on the X-Bar." Liam shot her a surprised look, wondering how she knew about his irrigation work. "People talk, Mr. Xander," she said quietly as the conversation shifted around them. "Not all stories about you involve your gun." That evening, as they headed back toward town, Liam found himself riding alongside the wagon, occasionally exchanging comments with Nora while Robert drove. The setting sun cast a golden glow across the landscape, reminding Liam of evenings long past when beauty had still mattered to him. "Thank you for today," Nora said as they neared Redemption Springs. "Your presence made a difference. Those families respect you even if they fear you a little." "I've given them reason to," Liam admitted. "Perhaps, but you've also shown them today that you're more than your reputation." She studied him in the fading light. Sarah would be proud of that. Her words stirred something in Liam's chest, an ache that wasn't entirely painful. "You speak of her as if you knew her." "In a way, I feel I do through her journal and Robert's stories," Nora replied. "She was remarkable." "Yes," Liam agreed softly. "She was." They reached town as twilight deepened into night. Robert headed to the boarding house stables with the wagon, leaving Liam and Nora standing in the street. "Would you like to join us for supper at the hotel?" she asked. "Mrs. Peterson's stew was hours ago." Liam hesitated, aware of curious glances from townspeople passing by. It had been years since he'd taken a meal in town, preferring to conduct his business and leave as quickly as possible. "Another time, perhaps," he finally said. Nora nodded, disappointment briefly crossing her features before she composed herself. "Of course. Good night, Mr. Xander." As he rode back to the ranch, Liam wondered at the strange emptiness he felt, as if he'd missed an opportunity for something he couldn't quite name. Over the next few weeks, Liam found reasons to visit town more frequently. He told himself it was necessary for ranch business, but he knew the truth was simpler. He wanted to see Nora Wallace. Their encounters were brief, a conversation on the street, a few minutes after church services, which he'd begun attending for the first time in a decade, an exchange of books when he learned of her love for reading. The townspeople noticed the change in Liam. His men noticed too, exchanging glances when he began joining them for meals instead of eating alone, when he started asking about their families, when his orders became requests. Robert extended his stay, working odd jobs around town and spending time at the ex-bar, rebuilding the connection that had been severed with Sarah's death. Liam found that having his brother-in-law around wasn't the burden he'd expected. Instead, it was a link to the past that didn't hurt quite as much as it once had. One crisp September evening, as autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Liam invited Nora to dinner at the ex-bar. He'd spent the day preparing, instructing his housekeeper to clean every corner of the long-neglected dining room and cooking a meal himself, skills he hadn't used since Sarah was alive. When Nora arrived, escorted by Robert, she looked around with appreciation at the ranch house that had been transformed. Fresh-cut wildflowers adorned the table, and lamps were lit throughout the downstairs, chasing away the shadows that had dominated the space for years. "Your home is beautiful," she said, running her hand along the polished wood of the banister Sarah had insisted upon when they'd built the house. "It feels welcoming." "It hasn't been that way for a long time," Liam admitted, "but it should be." Dinner was a simple affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, but the conversation flowed easily, with Robert sharing stories of his and Sarah's childhood, and Liam occasionally offering memories of his early years with Sarah on the ranch. After dinner, Robert excused himself to check on a sick calf with Timothy, leaving Liam and Nora alone on the porch. The night was cool but not cold, stars emerging in the vast Wyoming sky. "Thank you for tonight," Nora said, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "I've never seen Robert so at ease. Having you back in his life means more to him than he can express." "I should be thanking you," Liam replied. "If you hadn't brought Sarah's journal, if you hadn't." He trailed off, struggling to find the words. "Hadn't what?" Nora prompted gently. "Seen something in me worth saving," he finished quietly. Nora turned to face him fully. "I didn't save you, Liam. You saved yourself. You chose to read the journal, to reconnect with Robert, to rejoin the world. Because of you," he insisted. "Because you weren't afraid of me. Because you looked at me and saw something beyond the hardness." "I saw a man in pain," she said simply. "A man who'd lost everything and didn't know how to find his way back." Liam looked down at his hands, calloused from years of ranch work, but as Sarah had once written, capable of gentleness. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took Nora's hand in his. Her fingers were cool against his palm, but they curled naturally around his, as if they belonged there. It was the first time he'd initiated contact with another person in years, and the simple touch sent warmth spreading through his chest. "I don't know if I can be the man I was before," he said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be," Nora replied. "That man belonged to another time, another life. I'm interested in the man you are now, the one who's finding his way back to himself." Liam looked into her eyes, seeing no pity, no judgment, only a steadfast belief in possibilities he'd long ago abandoned. Something shifted inside him, like ice breaking up on a river after a long freeze, painful, but necessary for new life to begin. As autumn deepened into winter, Liam Xander continued his gradual return to the land of the living. He attended community gatherings, hosted neighboring ranchers for discussions about mutual concerns, and became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse. where he sometimes shared stories of the early days of Wyoming Territory with Nora's students. Robert eventually returned east but promised to visit again in the spring. Before leaving, he took Liam aside. "Sarah would be happy to see the man you're becoming again," he said, "and she'd approve of Nora. She always did have good taste in people." Liam didn't deny what was developing between him and the schoolteacher. How could he, when the whole town could see it in the way they sought each other's company, in the respect and affection that had grown between them? On Christmas Eve, with snow falling gently outside, Liam invited Nora to the ranch for dinner. The house was decorated for the holidays, the first time since Sarah and his son had died, with evergreen boughs and candles, creating a warm, festive atmosphere. After their meal, they sat before the fire, comfortable in shared silence. Liam reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in tissue paper. "I have something for you," he said, handing it to her. Nora carefully unwrapped it to reveal a delicate silver locket. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Open it," Liam encouraged. Inside was a tiny portrait of Sarah on one side, the other side empty. Nora looked at him questioningly. "Sarah was my past," Liam explained quietly. "The love we shared made me who I was. But that space," he pointed to the empty side, "that's for the future, for who I might become with you if you'll have me." Tears gathered in Nora's eyes. "Are you certain? I would never want to replace her." "You couldn't," Liam said simply. "Just as I couldn't replace whoever you've loved before, but perhaps we can build something new together." Nora reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. The gesture was simple but profound, the same one she'd made months ago when returning Sarah's journal, the touch that had begun to thaw his frozen heart. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Liam turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land in pristine white, a clean slate, a new beginning. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, a man who had forgotten how to love was learning to open his heart once more, guided by the gentle hand of a woman who had seen worth in him when he'd forgotten it existed. As midnight approached, Liam Xander, once the most feared man in 3 counties, bent his head and kissed Nora Wallace with all the tenderness he'd thought lost forever. And in that kiss was a promise of a future neither of them had expected to find in the wild territory of Wyoming, where second chances were as rare as gold and twice as precious. By spring, Redemption Springs was abuzz with news of their engagement. The wedding took place on a perfect June day in 1880, with Robert returning from the east to stand as Liam's best man. The entire community gathered to witness the union of their schoolteacher to the rancher, whose transformation had given the town's name new meaning. Years later, children played in the yard of the X-Bar Ranch house, a son with Liam's gray eyes and a daughter with Nora's auburn hair. Inside, Sarah's journal rested on a shelf alongside volumes of poetry and history. No longer a painful reminder, but a treasured connection to a love that had shaped a man's life. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Liam and Nora would sit on the porch, hands clasped together, watching the stars emerge over the land that had witnessed both his greatest sorrow and his unexpected joy. In those moments, Liam Xander, husband, father, rancher, and finally, after so many years, a man at peace, would silently thank the woman who had first taught him to love and the woman who had taught him to love again.